Welcome to the first ever episode of the Corboy Demetrio podcast. I am Bill Gibbs, and I'm a partner here at the firm, practicing law for about 20 years. I'm lucky to be joined today by three awesome guests. Tom Demetrio, the co-founder of our firm, Patrick Murphy, one of my partners, and Ken Lum. And we're going to be talking about issues related to aviation safety, this firm's involvement in airplane crashes over the years, and the relevance of all that to the most recent midair collision in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, for the first time in decades, we've seen a commercial airplane crash that's taken lives. And I'm lucky to be joined by Thomas A. Demetrio, who is one of our country's finest lawyers. He is recognized by almost every organization as a true trial lawyer for the people, a man that has devoted his entire life to representing victims of negligence and has significant experience in airplane crashes. So with that, Tom, welcome to the show. And can you tell us a little bit about your first ever airline case?
Thank you, Bill. Airline, commercial or private, or?
The first time you ever had a case involving an airplane?
That would have been in the mid-'70s. It was a private plane. There was a pilot and 5 passengers. And there was a runway in a little town in Louisiana, where at the end of the runway there was a tree, and the plane took off and it hit that tree, and all 6 people died. On that plane was Jim Croce, who was just becoming quite the superstar in the world of recorded music.
How old was Croce at the time?
Oh, he was in his late 20s.
Yeah.
And he was married. We had a video of him walking the beach with his 2-year-old son on his shoulders, singing. I mean, the son wasn't singing. Croce was singing, Time in a Bottle. And for those of you old enough to remember that song, it was a big one.
Are we talking Taylor Swift level? Was his fame
Well,
starting
he was on the rise.
Yeah.
And he had made a name for himself already, but he had performed at a small college in Louisiana that night, and he was on to his next college appearance the following night when this crash occurred. And unfortunately, everybody died, and the trial that actually had to take place involved one of his assistants that was on the plane. And that case was tried down in Dallas, Texas, the federal district court, in front of a judge by the name of Patrick Higginbotham, who was a terrific trial judge, and then Judge Higginbotham went on to the Fifth Circuit, and was in fact on George W. Bush, that is, shortlist for the Supreme Court. So I had a great opportunity. My first case involving an aircraft involved a great trial judge, a great set of facts for the plaintiff, and unfortunately, we won. They appealed, and I got to argue that case in the Fifth Circuit, and we won that appeal. And that was my first aircraft case.
So even though the crash happened in Louisiana and the case had to happen in Texas,
right,
a Chicago lawyer was involved. How does that come to be?
Well, the airline industry involving crashes, whether it's public or private planes, it's a small community. Those of us who do this kind of work are few and far between. And so the family whose case had to get tried, they live in Chicago. They lived in Chicago at the time.
Got it.
And so they hired our firm. And as far as jurisdiction goes, the aircraft was owned by a company in Dallas, Texas. And so you look at a case can usually be brought in one of two places: where the occurrence took place, or in a case like the Washington, D.C. tragedy, there'll be cases brought in federal courts throughout the land, but at some point there's a committee of judges that will meet and assign one of those federal judges all the cases. So I don't know where this case is going to end up, but my guess is it might end up in D.C., in Washington, D.C. But at any rate, venue, jurisdiction, where lawyers live, all of it plays into, the end game of how does it all happen? Circumstances.
We're also joined by Patrick Murphy, a great friend of mine and a dear mentor that taught me as a young law clerk how to be a lawyer and how to advocate for people, and I can't thank him enough. Patrick, you've been involved in some plane crashes as well in your career?
I have.
Tell
Also
us a little bit about your experience.
commercial and some private cases. Probably the biggest case that I was involved in was the United Flight 232 crash that happened July 19th, 1989 in Sioux City, Iowa.
What happened there?
That involved a DC-10, which has been decommissioned for maybe 20 years now. But if you remember Home Alone, the plane that took the family to Paris was a DC-10, and that's the plane that has two big engines on the wing and then the one engine in the vertical stabilizer in the tail. And they were flying from Denver to Chicago, 296 people on board. And after they took off, sometime into the flight, that tail engine exploded. And when it did, the shrapnel from the vertical stabilizer came down and severed all of the hydraulic piping, so to speak, the tubes, in the horizontal stabilizer. So all of the hydraulic fluid then drained out. So the flight crew then found themselves in the cockpit turning the yoke or the steering wheel and having no effect. So the plane gently started to go into a death spiral. And if you get into a spiral, it's over. Fortunately, on that plane, there was a deadheading DC-10 flight instructor, the real hero of that crash. His name was Denny Fitch, and he was able to come from the passenger cabin up to the flight deck. He actually flew the plane, kneeling on the floor, working the throttles, so that as the one wing would begin to dip, he would then rev that engine up to bring it back to a level position.
Wow.
Then it would go up higher, and then he'd have to do the other one. He did that for a period of 44 minutes, and they attempted to land in Sioux City, Iowa. The normal speed for a DC-10 on impact is about 130 miles an hour. This DC-10 landed at 200 miles an hour.
That's not good.
The landing gear gouged into the concrete runway, caused the wing to tip, hit the ground, and then cartwheel and explode. That happened on July 19th. That was a Wednesday. The firm was contacted by a surviving passenger on Thursday. We filed that lawsuit on Friday in state court. The first death case
In Illinois, or where was
in
it
Illinois.
filed?
We
Okay.
filed in Illinois against United, who is incorporated in Delaware, but principal place of business is Illinois. We named McDonnell Douglas, and we named GE the manufacturer of the engine. The first death case we filed on Monday, and that was actually referred to the firm by a former student of mine at Loyola, who I taught.
Wow.
And then the firm became the lead counsel in federal court and all the state court cases.
Where did that case proceed? Where was it in federal court?
All the federal court cases were multi-district assigned to Judge Suzanne Conlin here in Chicago. And there were 10 cases also filed in Missouri. So Phil Corboy was the lead counsel both in state court and federal court cases. I was the de facto lead counsel because I did all the legwork. And then when it came time to settle the cases, Tom Demetrio did all the settling of the cases. So we turned everything over to him, and he resolved the cases. What was interesting in that case is we represented two of the first-class flight attendants. We represented Denny Fitch, and there was a high-ranking executive from United whose daughter was a flight attendant. He also came to us. So we had that case and got to know 41 families. Some of them were deaths, some were survivors, very intimately in developing of the damages. And it was quite an experience representing these families in that crash.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. Now, in that crash, you had survivors, so you had people that could, talk about what had happened and what they experienced. In so many of these cases, there's no survivors. Tell our listeners, how is it figured out when, for example, in Washington, D.C., a helicopter and an airplane crash midair? How is the process of investigation unfolding as we speak today, and how will that lead to some conclusions about what the heck happened here?
A lot of the pre-impact terror was developed in 1979 in an American Flight 191 that crashed here in Chicago. And in that flight, which took off from Chicago, it went up and crashed, I think, 31 seconds after takeoff. The pilot in that crash was Walter Lux. And it was known that it was his style in taking off another DC-10, that he would play in the cabin on each seat's video screen the takeoff, sort of like a closed-circuit TV.
Wow.
So that each passenger would see the plane taking off and then beginning to turn over into a death spiral and down to a crash. So we knew from his methodology that he would have this camera on, and all those people, everybody in that DC-10 crashed, and including some people on the ground, that all those people saw what was happening. They had that pre-impact terror. So Phil Corboy, Tom Demetrio, who were lead counsels in that case, were able to develop through experts like psychiatrists and psychologists that this is what those people were going to be experiencing. They were going to be experiencing not only the psychological terror, but the physical manifestation of that terror, the throwing up, the heart pounding, the sweating, etc. And that's how we were able to develop pre-impact terror survival action for the first time.
Can I interrupt a minute?
Yep, of course.
Tell you a an interesting story about what Patrick's talking about. There's a very, very prominent criminal defense lawyer in this country at the time, very prominent. He's left us, but I'm still not going to use his name.
Can you tell us who he represented famously?
He represented he took a plaintiff's case, and instead of referring it to a civil airplane lawyer, he kept it. And he represented the family of this gentleman, and he wanted to show the jury how he suffered this pre-crash distress that Patrick's talking about. And so he exhumed the body of this gentleman, and they did an autopsy, and it showed that he was a relatively young guy, but he had arterial sclerosis to such an extent where he had about a month to live.
Oh, boy.
So what this lawyer, in effect, did was he ruined the value of the case because of the much shortened life expectancy that he would have had.
I want to turn to Ken Lum, who's with us as well. Ken is the managing partner of Corboy Demetrio, a dear friend and my partner, and we collaborate on a lot of things. Ken has experience in the military that I'd like to just kind of touch upon and see what your experiences have been, not only with serving in the military, but with claims against the federal government. It may turn out that this crash that happened in Washington, D.C. has some components in which the federal government would be implicated. We don't know enough yet, but can you tell us a little bit about what that means, where those cases would have to happen, and how that process plays out?
Sure. Well, the main impact will be the application of the Federal Tort Claims Act.
What is
or
that?
the FTCA. It is the only remedy against the United States for injury or death caused by the negligence of government employees. Before the FTCA was enacted in the middle of the last century, there was no remedy. The sovereign immunity was complete, right? The king can do no wrong.
You could not sue the government.
Could not sue the government. So the FTCA is a limited waiver of that immunity granted by Congress. And that's important because its requirements have to be very strictly followed, okay? And so basically, under the FTCA, the United States as an entity is responsible for injury or death caused by the negligence of federal government employees who are acting within the scope and course of their employment.
So that could be, I'm interrupting, but
It's good.
so that could be an air traffic controller, for instance,
Correct.
and that could be the military,
Correct.
for instance.
So active duty service members or reservists who are on active duty at the time, they are federal government employees. Any employee of a federal government or an executive agency is a government employee. So the FAA is is a federal agency under the Department of Transportation. So yeah, the FTCA would cover U.S. Service members, the crew of the UH-60, and any of the air traffic controllers, and then all the way up to the top of the FAA in terms of institutional or organizational negligence.
So these crashes are investigated by the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Bureau, and we're able, through the wonders of modern technology, to watch the latest update from the NTSB. I'm hoping we can cue that up, watch that, and then have a discussion about what we're hearing.
Currently, the CRJ, based upon the data recorder, at the time of impact, was at 325 feet, plus or minus 25 feet. This is from the belly of the CRJ. The CRJ itself is 20 feet and 8 inches from the wheel to the top of the tail. So from the belly, the CRJ at time of impact was 325, less or minus 25 degrees. And for those who follow this closely, that is a corrected altitude. It is based on the ADSB data and the flight data recorder. Our preliminary review of what the tower cab was showing on the data screen that would have been in front of the controllers was 200 feet near the time of the accident. The question is about spending time with the members' families. Yeah, I spent several hours with them today. There's more, some new, there's some that have been there for 3 days. There's some that want to give us hugs. There's some that are just mad and angry. They're just all hurt, and they still want answers, and we want to give them answers. Unfortunately, at some point, all of you are going to be gone. We're still going to have the investigation open. We're going to make recommendations. We go to East Palestine, a community that gets devastated. Still nothing's happened. We have several hundred recommendations open for aviation. You want to do something about it? Adopt the recommendation of the NTSB. You'll save lives. Get off and do something. I don't want to have to meet with those parents like that again. It's not fair.
Wow. It is horrible and a tragedy. Thoughts?
Yeah. I have several thoughts. First of all, I'd like to point out that historically, the NTSB does a terrific job in the investigation of these catastrophes. It has an excellent reputation for doing a thorough job. In our world, in the courtroom, the NTSB findings are not admissible. We can't say that the NTSB found this.
He couldn't be a witness at a trial in this case,
Well, he could. Yeah, no, he could be a witness.
but his report wouldn't come
the
in.
facts that they find are admissible at trial, just not their ultimate conclusion. In our world, that's for the jury to determine. Okay. And secondly, what I've heard so far, clearly, the helicopter was in a place it shouldn't have been. It was over 100 feet higher than it was supposed to be. This case, you asked earlier, what do we do? How do we find out what happened?
Right.
Well, it's already starting to happen as far as investigation goes. This corridor where these helicopters are every day, every hour, these helicopters take congressmen and senators back and forth to the airport. It's widely used. And it's also created, though, near catastrophes prior to this date because of its proximity to the airport. And
There were warning signs, you're
there
saying.
were all sorts of warning signs that this was an accident waiting to happen. That's the government's fault.
Devastating.
And what Ken was stating is you cannot sue the government. Okay, you have to first bring a claim, okay, against the government, and it typically will be denied. You then have, I believe it's 6 months, to file a suit against the government. However, no jury trial.
Oh,
No jury trial against the government. So a federal judge will decide what happened here and how much compensation the families are entitled to. If, in fact, it turns out, and again, in our world, what we have to prove is that a defendant, whether it's American Airlines or the military, or the flight of this helicopter, or the air traffic controllers, who we've learned were overworked, understaffed, and this one controller dealing with both the helicopter and the airplane, that shouldn't have been. So we have to prove that they were a cause of the occurrence. That's our job. So
not the only cause?
Not the only cause, just a cause.
Okay.
Just a cause.
So there could be multiple causes of a catastrophe.
There could be multiple parties responsible. For instance, in the Sioux City, Iowa crash, the DC-10 is right behind you, by the way, our model of it. The General Electric made a bad product, okay, and this fan broke into pieces and then severed the hydraulics, right? Well, that's not supposed to happen.
But you also wouldn't suspect that on day 1 or 2 or 3 or 100 after a crash like this.
No, but so General Electric's certainly at fault, but so McDonnell Douglas as the end product who utilized this component part, that makes McDonnell Douglas responsible as well. Okay? And so any crash, the helicopter can be at fault, like in D.C. Let's say the helicopter was where it shouldn't have been.
Right.
And had it been at 200 feet, this would not have occurred. But as I point out, since there have been near misses, this is something that could have been anticipated. To our flying public's ignorance, You know, so we know that the 67 people, let's say on the airplane, were innocent completely, right?
Right.
So then the question becomes the lawyers who are going to get involved in these cases for the families, they're going to be looking at liability of the FAA, the military. I haven't read anything yet about American Airlines, but that's going to have to be looked into in case there was negligence there, just in case there was. But and in that case, if American Airlines was a cause of what occurred, that entitles you to a jury trial.
Right. Because that's not the federal government.
Exactly. So it's going to be very, very complicated. But I think one of the first things I know that this firm, and we've already started looking into it, is the history of near misses between helicopters and airplanes at this airport. And there's a documented, there have been studies done, in fact, on this very subject prior to this occurrence.
What a shame.
Alerting the FAA, hey, you need to do something. Now, our new transportation secretary has stopped the military from flying in this corridor where this accident occurred. So that's a good start. And when the NTSB is done with its findings, I'm hoping that's going to be a permanent move.
Yeah, it was interesting.
It's a dangerous airport.
He was saying the NTSB makes recommendations. I assume that's to whomever might be involved
The
in
FAA.
in any catastrophe.
The FAA, the military. Okay, sure.
Yep. The NTSB, he was talking about East Palestine. That's a train derailment. So the NTSB investigated that and makes certain recommendations in hopes that either the railroad or the airline or the government will adopt those recommendations and make the world a safer place. I assume that's what he's saying. Have we had involvement in cases not only with airplanes but also helicopters?
We have. We've had a couple of cases in Hawaii where these helicopters that take tourists around volcanoes, inactive volcanoes.
I did that on my honeymoon.
Well, some
Yikes.
helicopters don't make it. We've been involved in that. One of my earlier helicopter cases involved a tragedy where a young father, 30-year-old father, and his 2-year-old son were taking a helicopter tour of Mount Rushmore. The rudder of the helicopter actually clipped Abe Lincoln's nose and
Wow.
broke, and the helicopter crashed. All the while, the wife and young mother was filming
Oh, no.
it on video. Yeah, it was terrible. And then Stevie Ray Vaughan, another musician, well-known, well-established, had a gig in Wisconsin and hopped on a helicopter to come to Chicago, and that helicopter crashed. We represented and killed Stevie Ray and others on the aircraft, and that was due to bad weather. Much like Kobe's helicopter
Right.
crashed, had a lot to do with fog, I believe.
Right.
But this was really inclement weather, and so that was pilot error for flying in inclement weather. You wait. So, yeah, we've had helicopter experience. This particular crash in D.C. Involving a Black Hawk helicopter was on a training mission, actually, of some sort, and which is not, again, unusual. It should have been unusual. It shouldn't have ever happened. But again, the communication between the air traffic controller controlling this aircraft, the Black Hawk helicopter, that's going to be a major part of the investigation that takes place here. So whether it's a helicopter or a small plane. I tried a small plane case called Scenic Airlines. It was a real airline, but just a small aircraft. Crashed on takeoff into the Grand Canyon. And it turned out the case was tried in federal court in Las Vegas, where both Pilot Air and Cessna, the manufacturer of the plane, were both found responsible. So that's an example of
Got it. Yeah.
two can be a cause.
In that plane crash, you did something unique to show the jury the culture of the family. Tell us
I
about
did.
that.
Well, the two girls that were on the plane with other passengers were on holiday from Kobe, Japan, and I knew that Las Vegas was a very, believe it or not, conservative area as far as lawsuits go. And a lot of former military live there. And I wanted the jury to understand the importance of a daughter to the family unit in Japan. And so I hired a prominent professor at Northwestern University to come and testify on the culture. His specialty was the culture of the Japanese people. And he testified, for instance, in the U.S., the color of mourning is usually considered to be black. Well, in Japan, it's white. So we went through all of that, and in Japan, it's the daughter, even if you have sons, it's the daughter who is expected to take care of you in old age. And so it was quite enlightening for the jury.
Big
and,
time. Yeah.
It turned out well.
When we were talking about helicopters, it struck me this night vision goggles question seems to be important to the NTSB. What's the deal with that? Why would that matter?
The main question is, were they wearing them at the time of the crash? They certainly had them, and they're not infrared. They're kind of light magnification devices. Part of the problem is you can lose some aspects of peripheral vision. Depth perception is a little different. I mean, these are experienced pilots, though, and they've flown hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours with these devices. Whether they're ever going to figure out whether they were actually wearing them at the time of the crash, I don't know that you can actually do that.
Yep.
But it may be important.
It softens the lighting, I assume, too?
Well, part of the problem is that it can be difficult to pick out different light sources. They may not have actually seen this plane. They may have mistaken it for a different plane. So you gain light magnification, you can see certain objects, but you lose certain other types of visual cues that we use with regular vision. And in fact, they usually wear them an inch or two away from their eyes so that they can kind of look around them when they need to, because they really kind of want to have both.
I think the byproduct of all this litigation is going to be that there's going to be some safety changes throughout the FAA. I think the evidence is going to show that the FAA has gotten complacent because we have had a relatively safe period of time for commercial crashes for 10 or 15 years. I think the technology has not been kept up. I watched that gentleman talking about that the comptroller's screen gets refreshed every 4 to 5 seconds. In the ride-sharing industry, their algorithm for their GPS, locating the car that is driving people around, refreshes every 3 seconds. So here, the FAA, where you have national transportation of people, they're behind the times. They are not updating their equipment. For what reason? Certainly can't be money. We have plenty of money in this country. Look at the deficit we're spending. I think the evidence is going to show that this staffing was 20% below what is normal for that time of the day. So this complacency, I think, has eroded and crept in all facets of the FAA. So as Tom pointed out, yes, maybe the obvious person at fault is the military helicopter pilot. But all of this other complacency and negligence factors into this crash.
Absolutely. That includes, communication. You've got to have clear communication between the tower and the aircraft.
And why couldn't the helicopter guy talk to the pilot?
And with each other, you would
Yes.
think. I mean, that just makes common sense, right?
What's a little scary to those of us in the public, there are 313 towers across the country where air traffic controllers are all understaffed. 313 towers.
Yeah, you wonder how many planes are up above us right now,
There are a lot.
right?
And so the question is, as Patrick alludes to, and even our president alluded to it, our equipment is outdated. We're not keeping up with the times. So I don't know, but things aren't always what they seem. If we can just jump back to the DC-10 that crashed at O'Hare Field in May of 1979. What happened there is 17 seconds into flight, this is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the left engine falls off. It just falls off.
That's not supposed to happen.
No. and then, total flight time, I think you're correct, 31 seconds, the plane crashed into the ground, killing everybody. Now, there's an engine on the right wing, the left wing, and then in the tail, as we discussed with Sioux City. And so why did that happen? Well, as it turns out, you would think that was the manufacturer's fault, right?
Absolutely.
McDonnell Douglas, who's now been eaten up by Boeing, if you will, made a plane where the engine fell off. So it's at fault.
You had to go to law school to reach that conclusion.
That is a product liability textbook case, okay? But as it turned out, during the extensive discovery, which included 60 depositions, okay, I might add, that when the plane was delivered to American Airlines, McDonnell Douglas gave it a maintenance book and what procedures were to be followed on a weekly and monthly basis. One of the things, and what happened on this particular engine, it's attached to the wing by something called the pylon. Let's say it's an object like this. Okay? And this pylon connects the engine to the wing. And it turned out that there were metallurgical fractures, not seen by the naked eye, that existed in this pylon that eventually it just failed. And that's why the engine fell off. But what developed was American Airlines failed to do the maintenance to check for these small metallurgical cracks. And had they would have been repaired, or the pylon would have been replaced, and the engine never would have fallen off. So it turns out the majority...
There you've got two defendants?
Exactly. And it turned out the major negligent defendant was American Airlines, not for failure to do maintenance, not the manufacturer.
Yeah,
So-
not the way I saw that going
Exactly.
when you started.
So what I'm saying in this D.C. case, I know people are frustrated, families especially, at the pace of the investigation. But it's okay. They're doing their job, I'm sure, and they're going to figure it out, okay? But the thing about what we do is we're not married to what they find out. We will be doing our own investigation when we're able to examine all the wreckage, et cetera, which we will. We will be able to do that.
Right.
When the NTSB is
with our own independent experts.
Exactly.
You know, I think you both brought up some very good points. That the crux of the matter is essentially a lack of a culture of safety. In any tragedy, you're always looking at the last cause, the human error. Whether a pilot was at an appropriate altitude, whether a controller appropriately communicated with aircraft in his airspace, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And often what puts people in those places where those things happen is a lack of a culture, of a safety culture. It's system errors. It's a lack of appropriate policies and procedures and training and resources. And kind of what I was thinking of wasn't an aviation case. What struck me was your most recent medical malpractice verdict in, what was it, 42 million? And it was almost entirely institutional negligence, wasn't it? I mean,
Yes,
it wasn't. It was about.
It was all institutional negligence. Hospital not having a culture of safety.
And I think that's a big part of what's going on here, particularly in the FAA.
That's a great point. Well, I mean, I've got the best guests in the world for my first episode. Is there anything else we want to talk about?
Well, I'm going to mention, okay, that what we do for families is assuming we maneuver the liability successfully, and I can tell you that in most major commercial aircraft cases, very few cases are actually tried. There's something about an airplane crash that causes sensationalism, if you will. The media, days and days and days will follow it, right?
Right.
As opposed to if somebody got hit by a bus. Okay, that's not going to make the 5 o'clock news, usually. And certainly not for days and days and days. But there's something about an air crash that causes defendants and their insurance carriers to settle these things. So very few of these cases actually get tried. All of the cases in the O'Hare Field case, the first case that was filed was by a widow from Sweden, and that was the first case that was tried. And when you file a case, you then have the ability to get subpoena power and to acquire records right away. That's the importance of filing right away.
Right.
Not because you're in a hurry to. It turns out her case was the last one to settle. So
First one filed, last one.
yeah, so the first
resolved.
shall be last, etc.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so what our job is then to acquire every nickel each family is entitled to. And that's what we did both in, Sioux City. We set the record. It was $25 million for a family of a gentleman who died, the largest settlement in a commercial aircraft case in the country. And then in 1994, there was an accident that we were very much involved in Pittsburgh, which involved a 737 where the rudder at the rear of the plane malfunctioned, causing a crash. And in that case, a gentleman from Pittsburgh, died, and his family recovered. We acquired $25,250,000 for him. That became the largest and remains the largest
To this day.
settlement. So that's what you want in a lawyer, though. You want a law firm that's going to acquire every nickel each client is entitled to, and it's going to take the litigation process also takes its time. I'm not going to say the wheels of justice move slowly, but it's a process, and so I think families will come to realize that once they've hired a law firm, they can let go and grieve properly, knowing their lawyers are doing all the right things on their behalf.
That's a good point.
And part of that in developing the damages for the family is constant communication with the family, not only in terms of the nickels and dimes, but talking to the family about the process so that they feel good about how the progress of this litigation is going, that you're taking the weight off of their shoulders. And that's why so many times, years after the cases have resolved, families stay in touch with us by sending Christmas cards, wedding invitations, things of that nature, because you really become very, very close with the family, and that's part of the hallmark of this firm.
Yep, isn't that the truth?
Yes.
One of the
Devastating to walk through tragedy with people, but
Yes.
it sure does.
one of the
pay
most
dividends.
satisfying experiences I've had in this area deals with Flight 191 O'Hare Field crash, where it turned out that it was the only major air crash in the country where a memorial wasn't supplied for these family members, and until recently,
A place that you could go.
a
to
place you can go
commemorate
and you know
the loss of your loved one. Yeah,
exactly, and a school in Decatur thought there should be one, and they reached out to me and others, including Jan Schakowsky, our representative for that area, and a slice of land in Des Plaines, close to where the plane actually ended up landing, was supplied. A memorial was built. A ceremony was had, and it was. I mean, I cried throughout the whole thing.
I'm sure.
And they named every single person that was on that plane at this ceremony, and this was in I think 2018. You know, it was long after May of 1979, but at least finally, family members had a place where their loved ones were remembered. So, very satisfying.
that is really what it's all about. And you've taught us that. You've taught me that. And I thank you for everything you've taught me in my career, Patrick, Ken. It's really a pleasure to sit here with you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to sit here with you every day, but particularly with microphones in front of us and a camera on. This has been really quite special. With that, that's a wrap.